I was halfway through casting a line off my private dock when I heard the screech. "Excuse me. What exactly do you think you're doing?" I turned around slowly, rod still in hand. There she was, Brenda Jefferly, president of our HOA, self-appointed neighborhood queen, and a walking violation notice. She stood at the edge of my property in a sun hat that could have doubled as a satellite dish. "Fishing," I said, like it wasn't obvious. "You are in violation of HOA Water Usage Guidelines, Section 4, Paragraph 7, she snapped, waving her clipboard like a sword. "You can't fish in the lake without HOA-approved permits, which you don't have. My dock, Brenda, my shoreline, my fish. The lake is community property. You may own the land under your dock, but the water is regulated by the HOA. You're going to be fined $150, she said, already scribbling. "I've lived here 12 years. No one's ever said a word. "Well, I'm president now," she said with that smug little tilt of her chin, "and I'm cleaning things up." That night I dug through every document I had, deed, neighborhood maps, HOA bylaws. And then I found something interesting, something Brenda clearly hadn't looked at. The lake wasn't community property. It was owned by a private entity, an old company that had been dissolved years ago. The rights to the lake had defaulted to their final asset holder, who was now accepting offers. The next morning I made a call. My name is Benton Clay, and I don't lose to clipboard tyrants. 2 weeks later, the lake was mine, not the shoreline, not the dock. The entire lake. I didn't announce it. I waited. 3 days after the paperwork cleared, Brenda showed up again. This time, she brought back up 2 of her HOA board members and her favorite lapdog, Carl, the treasurer. "You've now racked up 4 citations, she barked, holding out a stack of pink slips. "That's 600 in fines, and failure to pay will result in a lien against your property." I handed her a manila envelope. "What is this?" she asked, eyes narrowing. "Proof of ownership. I bought the lake." Brenda blinked. "You what?" "I own the water now, every inch. Including the permits you issue for fishing, boating, and swimming. Which, by the way, are all revoked, effective immediately," Carl sputtered. "You can't do that." "I can, and I did. You see, the HOA never had ownership, just assumed usage rights, and those are gone now. Along with your dock permits, party permits, and that kayak station you love so much." Brenda's face turned a shade of red I hadn't seen before. She looked like she was about to explode. "You're bluffing," she hissed. "County Records Office has all the updated paperwork. You're welcome to check." She stormed off without another word, her little army trailing behind, stunned silent. That night I stood on my dock again, cast my line, and waited. This time no one dared interrupt, but I knew Brenda. She wasn't going down without a fight. And I had a feeling she was about to do something very, very stupid. Brenda didn't show her face for 4 days, but her absence wasn't peace it was planning. I knew that much. On the 5th morning, a white SUV with tinted windows rolled past my house slower than usual. It stopped halfway down the road, idled for a few minutes, then drove off. The next day, the same SUV returned. This time, it parked just outside my view, but I could see the edge of the bumper from my workshop window. Someone sat inside for nearly an hour. That afternoon, I got a letter not from the HOA, but from a private environmental assessment firm. According to them, a concerned civic organization had submitted a request for an ecological audit of the lake, citing alleged violations of water quality regulations and mismanagement of natural habitat. I called the number on the letter. The woman who answered was polite until she realized I wasn't who she expected. The tone changed fast. "You're the new owner?" she asked. "Yes, and I'd like to know who's paying for this audit." "I'm not authorized to disclose that." "You just did." She hung up. The next morning, 3 men in reflective vests showed up at the lake's edge near the old community kayak rack. I walked over. "You've got no authority to be on the premises," I said, holding up the laminated copy of the property plat I kept in my tool shed. "We're conducting a preliminary evaluation. On private land, without consent, leave or I call the sheriff." They left. But they didn't seem surprised. That was Brenda's signature: provoke, wait, escalate. By the end of that week, 6 homes received letters from the HOA informing them that their dock permits were under review pending environmental compliance. One of those homes belonged to my neighbor, Ellie, a retired nurse who'd lived here longer than anyone. She showed up at my door with the letter in one hand and a container of blueberry muffins in the other. "I don't get it," she said. "They've never cared about any of this before. Why now?" "Because they can't control the lake anymore," I said. "So they're trying to scare people into thinking they still can." Ellie tapped the paper. "This says non-compliance could result in daily fines. They don't have enforcement power over anything touching the lake anymore. I'll back you if they try it." Ellie nodded and left the muffins. They were still warm. That night, I drafted a letter of my own, a cease and desist addressed to the HOA board, warning them against issuing any directives concerning the lake or its connected structures. I sent it certified to each board member. I also emailed a copy to the County Water Commissioner's office and attached my ownership documents. The next day, I found orange tape strung around my dock supports bright, reflective strips labeled "Under Investigation." There was no notice, no paperwork, just the tape. I checked the footage from my security cameras. 2 people had come around 3 in the morning, wearing hooded sweatshirts and gloves. One of them carried a clipboard. I printed the footage and drove straight to the sheriff's substation. The deputy on duty, a sandy-haired guy named Collins, took one look at the footage and raised an eyebrow. "You know who they are?" he asked. I recognize one of them. HOA board member. Her name's Darlene. She works at the title office downtown. Collins leaned back in his chair. "Trespassing, vandalism, and impersonating a city official if that tape was meant to look like a government order. That's serious." "I want to press charges," he nodded. "We'll pull the footage, log the complaint, and I'll have someone contact her for questioning." I left the station with a copy of the report and a time-stamped disc in my glove box. Before I got home, I swung by the print shop and placed an order for a dozen yard signs. Bright red, bold white letters. "This lake is private property. HOA has no authority here." By the following weekend, every house bordering the lake had one. That Monday, my mailbox was stuffed with another envelope, this one hand delivered and sealed with the HOA emblem. Inside, a single-page letter typed in all caps, "Notice of legal action pending." I sat down at my workbench and made a call. "Lance, it's Benton. You still doing real estate law?" "Not full-time," he said. "But I've got time. What's going on?" I explained everything. When I finished, there was a pause on the line. "Brenda's overplayed her hand," Lance said. "They're trying to intimidate you with letters and fake enforcement, but if they actually file anything in court, they'll have to prove they have jurisdiction, which they don't. And if they're using HOA funds to do it, that's misappropriation. Can you represent me?" "Gladly. And I'll file a counterclaim for harassment and defamation while I'm at it." 2 days later, Brenda called an emergency HOA meeting. I wasn't invited, but Ellie was. She brought a small recorder in her purse. "They're panicking," she told me afterward. "Carl said if a judge sides with you, they could lose insurance coverage, and Brenda, she told them she'd already hired a lawyer. Did the board approve that?" "Nope." Carl asked for a vote. Brenda shut him down and said, "It's an executive decision." That was it. Misuse of funds, violation of transparency rules, unauthorized legal expenses, all of it spelled trouble for the board. I sent the recorder transcript to Lance. He added it to the filing. Within a week, the court date was set. Brenda tried to delay. She filed a continuance claiming she hadn't been properly served. The judge denied it. Then she tried to reclassify the HOA as a special oversight entity to gain emergency powers over the lake. The county clerk laughed her out of the office. The day of the hearing, I walked into the courtroom with Lance and a folder of documents. Brenda arrived 15 minutes late, flanked by a lawyer in a pinstripe suit who looked like he charged by the syllable. Carl sat behind them, avoiding eye contact. The judge was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who didn't even look up when Brenda's attorney launched into a speech about civic duty and environmental protection. "Do you have ownership of the property in question?" the judge asked. "No, Your Honor," the lawyer admitted. "Then you have no standing." Lance stood. "Your Honor, we're requesting immediate injunctive relief to prevent further harassment as well as sanctions for misuse of HOA funds for unauthorized legal action." The judge nodded. "Granted. We'll schedule a hearing on damages next month. Until then, the HOA is prohibited from issuing any communications, directives, or statements regarding the lake." Brenda didn't speak a word as she left the courtroom, but Carl stopped me outside. "She never told us how bad it was," he said. "We thought she had legal grounds." "She never did," I said, "and now everyone knows it." That night, I hosted a cookout at the lake's edge. Ellie made lemonade. A few neighbors brought folding chairs. Someone played music from a speaker on their porch. The signs still stood along the shoreline, but now they were joined by something else: a petition signed by 34 homeowners, calling for a vote to remove the entire HOA board. It would be delivered the next morning, and this time there'd be no more shadows to hide in. The petition was delivered just after sunrise. It wasn't dramatic. Ellie placed it gently in the HOA's drop box, but the effect was immediate. By mid-morning, Brenda had called an urgent clarification session at the clubhouse. Flyers were taped to mailboxes, and an email blast went out 2 hours later with the subject line: "HOA stability in question. Your voice matters." I didn't attend. Neither did most of the lakeside homeowners. We already knew where we stood. Instead, I spent the afternoon with Lance reviewing the HOA's latest financial disclosures. He'd filed a motion for discovery after the court injunction, and the judge had granted it. What we found wasn't just mismanagement, it was criminal. Several transactions marked Lake Maintenance Initiative had been paid out over the past year, long before I ever bought the lake. But the companies listed didn't exist. We traced one to a P.O. box in another county. Another was supposedly a consulting firm registered under J.R. Whitmore, which matched no known business entity. But the routing number tied back to an account under the name Brenda Jefferly. Lance leaned back, tapping the manila folder with 2 fingers. "She's been laundering HOA funds into phantom service contracts." He wasn't smiling, neither was I. "Can we prove it?" "Already have. The county treasurer's office verified the transaction trail. This is wire fraud at minimum. And since HOA dues are pooled from residents across the neighborhood, that's felony-level embezzlement." I called Deputy Collins and gave him everything. He didn't hesitate. "I'll run it straight to the district attorney," he said. "You'll hear from us soon." That evening, I got a knock on the door. Not Brenda, not Carl. It was Dana, one of the newer residents, a single mother who'd moved in less than a year ago. She held a rolled-up newsletter in one hand and looked like she hadn't slept. "They're threatening to revoke my garage variance," she said. "I got approval from the last board, but now they're saying it was provisional and that I need to reapply or face penalties." "Let me see the letter." I skimmed it. It had Brenda's signature at the bottom, but the language was different, more hesitant, full of passive phrases like "subject to interpretation" and "pending broader review." "They're trying to make an example out of someone," I said. "You're new, so they think you won't push back." Dana looked uncertain. "Can they really do this?" "No, and if you want, I'll file a cease and desist on your behalf. They've got no authority to reverse prior approvals without cause." She nodded, then hesitated. "There's something else." She handed me her phone. The screen showed a picture of a group text on the neighborhood app, one that had mysteriously vanished hours later. In it, Brenda had written, "We need to tighten restrictions until we regain leverage. Start with the weaker properties." That was it. The phrase that would unravel her. I forwarded the screenshot to Lance. Within the hour, he'd added it to the complaint as intent to target and harass specific residents. The court granted an expedited hearing. The fallout began the next morning. A patrol car pulled up in front of Brenda's house just after 9. Two plainclothes officers stepped out, walked up her driveway, and knocked. She opened the door in a robe, visibly startled. They handed her a folder, exchanged a few words, and she disappeared inside. By noon, the sheriff's department released a statement confirming an active investigation into the HOA's financial practices. Local news picked it up by dinner time. The headline read, "HOA President Under Criminal Investigation for Alleged Embezzlement." That night, I hosted another cookout, this time with more chairs. Dana brought cupcakes. Carl came too quiet, subdued, and without the usual clipboard tucked under his arm. He waited until most people had left before approaching me. "You were right," he said. "There were things I didn't want to see. You were on the board, you had access." I asked questions. She shut me down, said I didn't have seniority to review certain budgets. Called them executive reserves. I should have pushed harder. I didn't let him off the hook, but I didn't push him away either. "You still have a chance to do the right thing," I said. "There's a recall vote coming. If you testify about what you knew, it'll help clean this place up." He nodded. "I'll be there." The recall meeting was set for the following Saturday. It wasn't held at the clubhouse. Brenda had tried to cancel the reservation after the investigation went public. But the community center downtown offered us a room for free once they heard why we needed it. Over 70 homeowners showed up, including some who hadn't attended a single HOA meeting in years. The atmosphere was tense but focused. A volunteer moderator read the petition aloud, then opened the floor for statements. Carl was the second to speak. "I failed this community," he began. "I trusted someone who used that trust to enrich herself. I saw red flags, I ignored them. I won't do that again." He sat down to stunned silence, but it didn't last long. One by one, residents stood and described how the board had used threats, misinformation, and selective enforcement to bully them. Dana spoke. Then Ellie. Then a man named Victor, who admitted he'd been afraid to speak up after Brenda threatened to report his home business for zoning violations. When the vote finally came, the result wasn't close. 68 voted for removal. 2 abstained. 1 voted no. Brenda wasn't present to see it. She'd resigned the day before, citing personal health challenges. But the sheriff's department confirmed she was still under investigation, and the DA's office had issued a subpoena for her financial records. The interim board was formed that night. Carl declined to run. Ellie didn't. She was elected president by unanimous vote. The next week, Ellie called me. "We found something else," she said, "tucked behind old personnel files. It's a list of houses Brenda labeled as non-compliant risks. She marked them for future enforcement priority. Some of them didn't even have violations." "Give it to Lance," I said. "There's still more cleanup to do." The new board began reviewing every fine, variance denial, and enforcement action issued over the past 3 years. They reversed over 24 citations and refunded nearly $12,000 in improper fines. As for the lake, it remained mine. But I did something unexpected. I offered the board a license agreement for free, allowing residents to continue using it for recreation, as long as no permits or fees were imposed and no HOA oversight was attempted again. The lake would remain protected but accessible. Fair, not weaponized. Ellie brought the new board to my dock one afternoon and signed the agreement in person. "We're not letting this happen again," she said. "Not under my watch." "You've got my support," I told her, and I meant it. The fishing was better these days. Not because the lake had changed, but because the people around it finally had. The morning after the recall vote, I woke up to silence. No flyers taped to mailboxes, no clipboard patrols doing laps around the neighborhood, no veiled threats disguised as memos. It felt strange. The kind of strange that comes after a long storm when the birds haven't figured out it's safe to sing again. I walked down to the lake with a fresh cup of coffee and sat at the edge of the dock. The surface was still, glassy. A blue heron stood motionless on a rock near the far end, and for the first time in weeks I didn't feel the urge to look over my shoulder. The peace didn't last long. At 8:10, Ellie called. I just got off the phone with the county's auditor's office, she said. There's more. A lot more. I stood up, already heading back toward the house. What did they find? Transfers, dozens of them scattered across 6 accounts. The HOA's books were doctored. Brenda had help, and it wasn't just illegal, it's federal. I paused halfway up my porch steps. Tell me everything. Ellie didn't wait. She laid it out. Brenda hadn't just funneled HOA funds into fake contractors. She'd rerouted dues into a shell nonprofit registered as a community environmental education foundation. The foundation's registered address matched a vacant storefront downtown, and the taxpayer ID linked back to a man named George Langley, a former paralegal who'd been disbarred for document forgery. Langley had been buried in the records, listed as a consultant on 2 invoices from the previous year. His signature had appeared nowhere else. The county flagged the transactions for fraud, but what really triggered the alarm was a transfer made 3 weeks prior, just days before Brenda resigned, when $52,000 vanished from the HOA's reserve fund. Ellie's voice was tight. The account it landed in was opened a month ago in another state, and the authorized signatory, it's her, full name, address, matching driver's license. I called Lance before I hung up. By noon, the district attorney had issued a bench warrant for Brenda's arrest and opened a joint investigation with federal officials for financial crimes crossing state lines. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit was now involved. When the news broke that evening, I didn't celebrate. Not because I wasn't relieved, but because the scale of it sank in. Brenda hadn't just bullied people or bent rules, she'd built a system designed to drain them dry. Later that night, I got an email from someone I hadn't heard from in over a year. Tim Varner, a former HOA board member who'd resigned quietly about 16 months ago. His message was brief. I always knew something wasn't right. I have the original financials from the year before she took over. Let me know if the board wants them. I met with him the next morning at a diner just outside the neighborhood. He brought a battered file box with him and slid it across the table. She started changing how we tracked expenses right after she took office, Tim said. Removed line item budget reviews from the public meetings, claimed it was to streamline decision-making. I didn't push back hard enough. That's on me. I opened the box. Inside were printed ledgers, old bank statements, and meeting minutes from the sessions Brenda had never officially recorded. There were notes scribbled in the margins, things like question reserve transfer, ask about unauthorized landscaping bid, and more than once, Carl confused again. I handed the box to Lance later that afternoon. That's enough to build a racketeering case, he said after flipping through the contents. She didn't just embezzle. She manipulated governance structures to cover it up. That's organized fraud. The new board convened a special meeting the next day, not to vote, but to inform. Ellie stood at the front of the community center, not with a microphone, but with a printed packet for every homeowner in attendance. Inside was the full breakdown. Every misappropriated dollar, every bogus contractor, every transaction under review. Lance stood beside her, answering questions calmly and clearly. I've forwarded all documentation to the state attorney general's office, he said. The HOA will comply with all subpoenas. We're also cooperating fully with federal investigators who are treating this as a multi-jurisdictional offense. A man in the back raised his hand. Can we get our money back? We're working on it, Ellie said, through restitution, but it won't be quick. What we can do immediately is freeze all dues until we rebuild the budget from scratch. There was a pause. Then someone clapped. It spread, quiet at first but steady. For the first time in over a year, the neighborhood was on the same page. 2 days later, Brenda was picked up in Georgia trying to board a flight under a false name. The authorities found 2 prepaid phones, 3 burner debit cards, and a briefcase with nearly $20,000 in cash. She didn't resist. When the charges were formally announced, wire fraud, money laundering, falsifying financial records, and conspiracy to commit racketeering. The total count was 14 felonies. Her bail was denied. Carl testified before the grand jury 2 weeks later and was granted immunity in exchange for full cooperation. His statement confirmed that the board had never voted on financial decisions above $5,000, a requirement in the HOA charter. Brenda had routinely bypassed it, claiming she had emergency executive authority. That phrase would later appear in the court's findings as entirely fabricated. With Brenda out of the picture and the investigation underway, the neighborhood began to heal. The kayak racks were removed by volunteers who repurposed the wood into benches along the trail. The faded playground was restored using donations, not dues. And the Lake Still Mine was alive again. Kids skipping stones, neighbors fishing in the evenings, paddleboards drifting quietly at dusk. One evening, Ellie stopped by with a large envelope. "We've drafted a charter revision," she said. "No more unchecked executive decisions. Every expense over $1,000 has to be posted publicly for 72 hours before a vote. We're also installing a resident oversight committee." I signed the petition without hesitation. A few weeks later, I received a letter from the state attorney's office. It confirmed the charges against Brenda and informed me that I would be listed as a victim witness in the case due to the targeted harassment and attempted financial coercion. I agreed to testify if needed, but I didn't have to. Brenda took a plea deal in exchange for a reduced sentence, 7 years, minimum security, with restitution required before parole eligibility. She forfeited multiple accounts and surrendered the deed to a property in another state, which would be liquidated to repay funds to the HOA. The judge made a statement at the sentencing that stuck with me. This defendant weaponized community governance for personal gain. She turned neighbors into targets and oversight into a tool of suppression. That is not simply fraud, it is betrayal. I watched the hearing from a courtroom bench near the back. When it ended, I walked outside into the afternoon sun and didn't look back. Months passed. The neighborhood held its first annual community day in years. No speeches, no policy votes, just food, music, and people who finally remembered what it felt like to trust each other. I still fished. Sometimes Ellie joined me. Sometimes Dana brought her son down to throw breadcrumbs to the ducks. The signs around the lake stayed up not as warnings, but as reminders. Not of ownership, but of what it took to reclaim balance. And every time I cast a line, I remembered that this all started with one person telling me I wasn't allowed to stand on my own dock and fish. Turned out, I was allowed. More than that, I was right. And now, so was the neighborhood.